No woman in America had ever been offered $5 million just to become someone's wife, especially not a woman who was about to lose everything. Naomi Carter had exactly 37 minutes before the bank legally took possession of the small house her late mother had spent 30 years paying for. The electricity had already been disconnected. The refrigerator was empty. The moving boxes stacked around the living room weren't for a new beginning. They were for eviction. She thought the worst day of her life had already arrived. She was wrong. Outside, a black armored Rolls-Royce quietly stopped in front of the house. Every curtain on the street shifted. Children stopped playing basketball. Even the mailmen slowed down. 3 attorneys climbed out. Not assistants, not security guards, attorneys. The oldest among them carried a silver briefcase chained to his wrist, the kind usually reserved for government secrets or billion-dollar mergers. None of them looked at the neighbors. They walked straight to Naomi's front door. Knock, knock, knock. She almost ignored it. Debt collectors had been knocking for weeks. When she finally opened the door, the lead attorney didn't introduce himself. He simply asked, "Miss Naomi Carter," her stomach tight. Yes, he unlocked the briefcase. Inside sat 1 document, 1 fountain pen, 1 cashier's check, made out for $5 million. Naomi frowned. "I think you've made a mistake." Attorney looked directly into her eyes. "No, Miss Carter. Our client never makes mistakes." He gently pushed the contract toward her. "Money becomes yours the moment you agree to one condition." Naomi hesitated. "What condition?" The attorney answered without the slightest change in expression. "You will legally marry Mr. Alexander Kingston for exactly 6 months." Room fell silent. Naomi laughed, not because it was funny, because it was impossible. America's youngest billionaire, the man who rejected actresses, ignored supermodels, and hadn't been seen with a woman in over 8 years, wanted to marry her. There has to be another Naomi Carter. There isn't. You've got the wrong address. Don't. Never met him. Attorney paused, then quietly said the sentence that would destroy everything Naomi believed about her own life. He specifically requested you. Naomi felt the blood drain from her face. How could the most powerful billionaire in America know her name? When she'd never even seen him in person, what the attorney said next was even stranger. "If you refuse, our client instructed us to leave immediately and never tell you why he chose you." Contract remained on the table, untouched. $5 million, 6 months, 1 billionaire, 1 woman who had absolutely no idea that she'd already changed his life years ago, without ever knowing he existed. Before we dive deeper into Naomi's unbelievable journey, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing our stories reach people from all around the world. And if you're enjoying this story so far and you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss any of our upcoming emotional stories filled with mystery, unexpected twists, and unforgettable endings. Now, let's find out why America's most emotionally unavailable billionaire chose Naomi, and what secret has been waiting years to change both of their lives forever. The contract remained untouched on the small kitchen table long after the attorneys had driven away. Outside, curious neighbors slowly returned to their routines, though more than a few continued peeking through half-closed curtains. They had watched expensive luxury vehicles arrive in a neighborhood where most families struggled to keep old pickup trucks running. Inside the house, silence settled over every room. Naomi stared at the thick stack of papers. $5 million. The number looked almost unreal. It was more money than anyone in her family had earned across generations. She reached for the contract, then stopped. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. "If something looks too easy, baby, make sure you know what it wants from you before you take it." Naomi slowly pushed the document away. She wasn't signing anything. Not today. Not until she understood why. At 5:30 the next morning, her alarm rang exactly as it had every day for the past 4 years. Nothing about her routine had changed. She still boiled water because the coffee maker had broken months ago. She still counted every dollar before leaving the house. She still packed peanut butter sandwiches because buying lunch every day simply wasn't possible anymore. The foreclosure notice hanging beside the refrigerator caught her attention again. 10 days. That was all the bank had given her. 10 days before the house that had sheltered 3 generations of her family would belong to someone else. She gently touched the faded photograph taped beside the notice. Her mother smiled back from the picture, wearing an old gardening hat and dirt-covered gloves. The photograph had been taken only weeks before cancer stole her laughter. "This house stays in the family," her mother had whispered during her final days. Naomi had made that promise. She intended to keep it, even if she had no idea how. The city was just waking as Naomi boarded the first bus toward St. Anne's Medical Center. She recognized nearly every regular passenger: a janitor heading downtown, a school crossing guard, a bakery employee still smelling faintly of fresh bread. People working hard simply to survive. Naomi fit right in. No one on the bus knew she'd been offered $5 million the night before. She barely believed it herself. The hospital cafeteria came alive before sunrise. Coffee brewed, breakfast trays rolled across polished floors. Kitchen staff laughed despite the early hour. Naomi tied on her apron, tucked loose curls beneath her hair covering, and immediately began helping prepare breakfast. She wasn't a nurse. She wasn't a doctor. Officially, she worked in dietary services. Unofficially, she seemed to know half the patients by name. "Morning, Miss Alina." The elderly woman smiled from her wheelchair. "I was hoping you'd be here." Naomi knelt beside her. "How's our deal?" Miss Alina smiled mischievously. "If I finish my oatmeal, you get one extra cookie after lunch." They both laughed. Nearby nurses smiled without interrupting. Everyone knew Naomi had a gift. She remembered birthdays. She remembered favorite meals. She remembered which patients secretly feared being alone more than surgery itself. Sometimes she simply sat beside someone during her break because they had no family visiting. No supervisor had ever asked her to do that. She simply believed kindness belonged everywhere, especially inside hospitals. Near lunchtime, she noticed Mr. Harold sitting quietly by the window, a retired history teacher, 86 years old, recovering from hip surgery. His lunch tray remained untouched. She carried another chair beside him. "No appetite today," he sighed. "My wife always made grilled cheese on Thursdays." Naomi smiled softly. "Give me 10 minutes." She wasn't supposed to leave the serving line. She did anyway. A few minutes later, she returned carrying a simple grilled cheese sandwich she'd convinced one of the cooks to make. Nothing fancy, just buttered bread, melted cheese, tomato soup. Mr. Harold looked at the meal, then at Naomi. His eyes watered. "My Margaret used to cut mine diagonally." Without speaking, Naomi picked up the knife and quietly sliced it exactly that way. The old man couldn't stop smiling. "Thank you," she simply squeezed his shoulder. "Welcome." Sometimes healing wasn't medicine. Sometimes it was remembering someone still mattered. Her shift officially ended at 3. She clocked out, walked upstairs, changed uniforms, clocked back in. Second shift, double pay, double exhaustion necessary. Every extra dollar went into one account. The house fund, its balance was painfully small. Nowhere near enough to stop foreclosure. She never complained. She simply worked harder. That evening, her younger brother Marcus waited outside the employee entrance with his backpack. 16 years old, too smart for his own good, too stubborn to admit how scared he really was. "You skipped dinner again." "I ate." He raised one eyebrow. "A granola bar isn't dinner," she smiled. "When did you become the responsible one?" "When Mom left me in charge." Joke landed gently, neither laughed. They both missed her too much. Marcus walked beside his sister toward the bus stop. "I heard from Mrs. Delgado," Naomi groaned. "What now?" "She wants us to move into her basement until we get back on our feet." "That's generous." "So why'd you tell her no?" Naomi looked ahead. "Because she already has enough to worry about. You can't keep refusing help." "I'm not refusing kindness." "Then I'm refusing to become someone else's burden." Marcus shook his head. "Been carrying everyone else for years." She smiled without answering. The following afternoon, she visited the bank during her lunch break. The loan officer looked genuinely uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, Miss Carter. There has to be something. We've extended every deadline legally available. Just need more time." "I wish I could give it." He slid another document across the desk. "If payment isn't received within 10 days, foreclosure proceedings will begin." 10 days, again, always 10 days. She thanked him anyway. Even disappointment deserved dignity. As she stepped outside, rain began falling, soft at first, then steady. Naomi stood beneath the awning, staring across the street. She could sign the contract. $5 million would solve everything. The mortgage, Marcus's college tuition, medical bills, every worry. Yet something inside her refused to believe anyone gave away that kind of money without asking for something far more valuable in return. She folded the foreclosure notice into her purse. There had to be another way. There had to be. That evening, as the sun disappeared behind the rooftops, another unfamiliar luxury vehicle pulled quietly in front of the Carter home. Not an SUV this time. A long black sedan. No convoy, no lawyers, just one driver, one passenger. The rear door opened. A tall man stepped onto the sidewalk wearing a charcoal overcoat despite the warm evening. He didn't look around. He didn't acknowledge the curious neighbors. He walked alone toward Naomi's porch with the calm confidence of someone accustomed to carrying impossible responsibilities. Naomi opened the front door before he could knock. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. She recognized him immediately. Every newspaper, every magazine, every business interview, America's youngest billionaire, Alexander Kingston. His expression revealed almost nothing. His eyes, however, carried a weariness that couldn't be hidden behind wealth or power. Naomi waited for an explanation. Instead, he spoke only one sentence. "I don't expect you to love me." Nothing more. He turned, walked back toward the waiting car. Within moments, the sedan disappeared around the corner. Naomi remained frozen on the porch long after the taillights vanished into the night. If he didn't expect love, then why did he want the marriage at all, and what kind of man offered $5 million while already believing his future wife could never love him? The next morning, Naomi woke before dawn, but sleep had done little to quiet her thoughts. She could still hear the billionaire's voice. "I don't expect you to love me." It wasn't a demand. It wasn't a warning. If anything, it had sounded like the quiet confession of a man who had stopped expecting love from anyone long ago. She shook the thought away. Whatever his reasons were, they weren't her concern. She had a double shift to work, a mortgage she couldn't pay, and a younger brother who deserved a future better than the one life seemed determined to hand them. She couldn't afford to think about billionaires. At exactly 9 o'clock, the familiar black SUV returned. This time, Naomi was ready. She invited the attorneys inside before the neighbors could gather outside again. The lead attorney placed the silver briefcase on the kitchen table. "Assume you've reviewed the contract." "Read enough to know I'm not signing it." Attorney nodded politely as though he had expected that answer. "Mr. Kingston anticipated your hesitation." "I don't hesitate when something doesn't make sense." She folded her arms. "Never met him. I know nothing about him except what people say on television. Somehow he wants to marry me." "Why?" The three attorneys exchanged brief glances. Finally, the oldest among them spoke. "I'm afraid our client instructed us not to answer questions regarding his personal reasons." Naomi laughed softly. "So I'm supposed to marry a stranger without knowing why? We're here only to explain the agreement." He slid a thinner document across the table. "These are the conditions." Naomi reluctantly looked down. The attorney spoke calmly, almost like someone reading the rules of a business merger. "Marriage will last exactly 6 months." She said nothing. At the end of 6 months, both parties agree to an uncontested divorce. Another page turned. "You will maintain separate bedrooms at all times." Naomi looked up. "So this isn't a real marriage." "Is legally real. Privately. It is a contractual arrangement," he continued. "You will attend public events together when requested. You will appear as husband and wife during charitable functions, business galas, and family gatherings. You are under no obligation to develop a romantic relationship. Physical intimacy is required. No interviews. No discussions with the media. No books. No documentaries. No public statements concerning the agreement. Everything remains confidential." He reached the final page. "If all conditions are fulfilled for the entire 6-month term, $5 million will be transferred into your account immediately." Silence settled over the room. $5 million, enough to erase every debt, enough to send Marcus to college, enough to rebuild the life her mother had worked so hard to create. The attorney gently pushed a pen toward her. Naomi didn't touch it. Instead, she slowly closed the folder. "I'm sorry." Attorneys waited. "I can't. Miss Carter, I don't care how much money is involved." She stood. "My mother didn't raise me to marry someone because I'm desperate. This house may disappear. I may have to start over. I won't sell my name. Attorney gathered the papers without argument. As you wish. Within minutes, they were gone. Naomi watched the SUV disappear down the street for the first time in weeks. She felt strangely proud of herself. She had chosen dignity over desperation. 3 days passed. Life returned to its familiar rhythm. Morning buses, hospital shifts, late-night grocery lists calculated down to the last dollar. Marcus pretended everything was normal. Naomi pretended to believe him. Neither wanted the other to carry more worry than necessary. On Friday afternoon, Naomi finished work earlier than expected. She decided to surprise Marcus at school. When classes ended, students streamed into the parking lot. Marcus wasn't among them. She found him sitting alone near the football field. He looked defeated. His old blue pickup truck wasn't parked where it usually sat. "Where's your truck?" Marcus forced a smile. "It was getting old anyway," Naomi frowned. "What happened?" He avoided her eyes. "I sold it." The words landed like a punch. "Sold it, Marcus." "I figured." He shrugged awkwardly. "It was worth more helping you than sitting in the driveway." Naomi couldn't breathe. "You sold your truck. It's just a truck." "It was Dad's truck." "I know. You rebuilt that engine with Grandpa." "I know. You've dreamed about restoring it since you were 12. Marcus finally looked at her. "What good is a truck if we don't have a house to park it in?" Naomi stared at him. He reached into his backpack and quietly handed her an envelope inside. Cash. Every dollar from the sale. She looked at the money, then at her little brother. "You were saving this for college. Figure college out later. You need this now." She suddenly pulled him into a hug. The tears came without warning, not loud, not dramatic, just years of pressure finally breaking. She cried for their mother, for their father, for the promises she couldn't keep, for the childhood Marcus had quietly sacrificed without ever complaining. "Supposed to take care of you," she whispered. "You do." "Doesn't feel like it." Marcus smiled through his own tears. "Never let me face anything alone." "So why should you?" That evening, Naomi added Marcus's money to the savings account. It still wasn't enough, not even close. Monday morning brought another letter from the bank, certified mail. She opened it standing on the front porch. Her hands began trembling before she finished reading, due to legal processing changes. The foreclosure date had been moved forward, not 10 days, 6. She read the letter again. Then again. The words never changed. 6 days. The house wasn't slipping away anymore. It was being ripped from beneath them. That night, Naomi sat alone in the living room. The unsigned contract rested inside its envelope beside her. She hadn't thrown it away. Perhaps because part of her had always known she couldn't. She looked around the house. The worn wooden staircase her father had built. The pencil marks on the kitchen wall measuring Marcus's height through the years. The porch swing where her mother used to shell peas during summer evenings. Every corner carried a memory. If she lost this place, she wasn't just losing property. She was losing the last place where her family still felt whole. She quietly picked up the phone. "My name is Naomi Carter." She paused. "Like to speak with Mr. Kingston's attorneys." The conference room overlooked the city skyline. Floor-to-ceiling windows reflected the afternoon sun across polished marble floors. Naomi felt strangely out of place, wearing the same navy blue dress she'd worn to church on Easter for the past 3 years. The attorneys greeted her with respectful silence. The contract already waited on the table. No pressure, no speeches, no persuasion, only one decision. Naomi read every page again, slowly, carefully. She refused to sign something she didn't understand. When she reached the final page, she closed her eyes. "I'm doing this for my family." No one answered. She picked up the pen. Her signature appeared one careful letter at a time. Naomi Carter. The ink had barely dried when another door opened. She turned. Alexander Kingston walked into the room alone, dark suit, calm expression, the same unreadable eyes. He approached the table and looked at the contract. One signature remained, his own. He picked up the pen then. Instead of signing, he looked directly at Naomi. His voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "What was your mother's favorite flower?" Everything inside Naomi stopped. She had never mentioned her mother. The attorneys hadn't mentioned her. The contract certainly hadn't, yet somehow this stranger knew her mother existed. More importantly, he asked the question as though the answer mattered. Naomi searched his face for recognition, for explanation, for anything that made sense. There was nothing, only patient silence. How could the most private man in America know anything about the woman who had raised her? And why did it seem as though he already knew the answer before she'd spoken a single word? 3 days after signing the contract, Naomi stood at the front gate of Kingston Estate with a single suitcase in one hand and a canvas tote in the other. The estate stretched across rolling hills outside the city, hidden behind towering oak trees and wrought iron gates. It looked less like a home and more like a place where history had decided to settle. As the gates opened, Naomi took a slow breath. This wasn't her world. It never had been. The car followed a winding driveway lined with gardens that seemed impossibly perfect. Fountains reflected the morning sunlight, and sculptures stood quietly among carefully trimmed hedges. When the vehicle stopped beneath the grand entrance, a butler opened the door before Naomi could reach for the handle. "Welcome to Kingston Estate, Mrs. Kingston." Title caught her off guard. For a moment she forgot this marriage existed only on paper. Inside, the entrance hall echoed with quiet elegance. Marble floors, high ceilings, and portraits of generations past filled the space, but nothing felt cold. Everything was meticulously cared for. A woman in her 60s approached with a warm smile. "I'm Evelyn, the house manager. If you need anything at all, you only have to ask." Naomi smiled politely. "Thank you." One by one, the household staff introduced themselves: the chef, the groundskeeper, the security director, the housekeepers, and the chauffeur. To Naomi's surprise, no one treated her like an outsider. They treated her with simple respect. It made the transition easier than she expected. Later that afternoon, Adrian met her in the main foyer. He wore a charcoal suit, his expression as calm as ever. "Show you the house." Tour was practical rather than extravagant. He pointed out the kitchen, the library, the gardens, and the guest wing before leading her upstairs. He stopped outside a beautifully furnished bedroom overlooking the lake. "This is yours." Naomi looked around. "It's beautiful. My room is at the opposite end of the hallway." She remembered the contract: separate bedrooms, separate lives for 6 months. He nodded once. "If anyone asks, we present a united front." "I understand. If you need privacy, you'll have it. If you need space, take it." She hesitated. "And if I need answers?" A faint smile appeared before disappearing just as quickly. "Answer what I can." It wasn't the answer she had hoped for, but it wasn't a refusal either. Within days, Naomi discovered that marrying a billionaire involved far more public appearances than she had imagined. There were charity luncheons, hospital fundraisers, museum galas, business receptions. Each event introduced her to people who measured worth by influence, wealth, and family names. She remained quietly herself. She thanked servers by name. She remembered volunteers' faces. She spoke with veterans, teachers, and nurses long after others had moved on to more influential guests. Some noticed, others dismissed her. The first board reception proved more difficult. Executives from Kingston Holdings filled the ballroom, discussing acquisitions and quarterly projections. Naomi felt out of place among tailored suits and polished conversations. Then she met Victoria. Victoria Sterling was elegant, confident, and clearly accustomed to being the center of attention. She approached with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "So you're Naomi." "I am." Victoria looked her up and down. "I expected someone different." Naomi simply smiled. "I imagine expectations can be misleading." Several nearby guests exchanged curious glances. Victoria continued. "I hear you worked in a hospital cafeteria." "I did. That must be quite an adjustment." "It is. Suppose silverware is arranged differently here." A few uncomfortable laughs drifted through the room. Naomi could feel dozens of eyes watching. She could have walked away. Instead, she answered gently. "In the hospital, I learned something very valuable." Victoria folded her arms. "And what's that?" "No matter how wealthy someone is, everyone eventually depends on the kindness of another person." Room fell silent. Naomi's voice never rose. She wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. She was simply telling the truth. An elderly board member slowly nodded. "I believe she's right." Conversation shifted. Victoria forced a smile, but the moment had passed. Naomi had defended herself without raising her voice or insulting anyone. As they left the reception, Adrian glanced toward her. "You handled that well." She looked at him in surprise. "Had practice." He almost smiled, almost. Over the following weeks, Naomi noticed something increasingly unusual about her husband. Nothing seemed capable of provoking him. Investors challenged him, journalists criticized him, competitors spread rumors, board members argued over decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Adrian listened. He answered calmly. He never shouted, never humiliated anyone, never reacted in anger, even when people clearly expected him to. One evening, Naomi finally asked, "Don't things ever make you angry?" He looked out across the gardens before replying. Anger usually solves the smallest part of the problem. The rest requires a clear mind. It was another answer that explained very little, yet somehow it felt deeply personal. Life inside the estate slowly settled into a rhythm. Some mornings, Naomi shared breakfast with the kitchen staff before attending charity meetings. Other afternoons, she volunteered at children's literacy programs using the Kingston Foundation's resources. She laughed more than she expected. The gardeners insisted she help harvest tomatoes from the estate greenhouse. The chef taught her how to bake French pastries. The elderly librarian challenged her to weekly chess matches she rarely won. For the first time since her mother's passing, moments of genuine happiness found their way back into her days. Even so, questions remained. Who was Adrian when no one was watching? Why had he chosen her? And what burden did he carry so quietly? One rainy evening, while searching for a book Evelyn had recommended, Naomi wandered into a quiet corridor she had never noticed before. Most of the doors were locked. One stood slightly open. Curiosity drew her inside. It wasn't a study. It was a private library. Floor-to-ceiling shelves surrounded a large wooden desk, but it wasn't the books that caught her attention. An entire wall had been carefully covered with framed newspaper clippings, not about billionaires, not about stock markets, not about politics. They told stories of ordinary people, a teacher who bought winter coats for every child in her classroom, a firefighter who rescued a family during a flood, a teenager who organized a neighborhood food drive. Each article had been preserved with remarkable care. Naomi stepped closer. Near the center of the wall, one familiar photograph stopped her cold. It showed a younger version of herself outside St. Anne's Medical Center, helping an elderly patient into a wheelchair after a snowstorm. She remembered the day. A local reporter had taken the picture years earlier for a small human interest story. She had forgotten it existed. Someone else never had. Why would Adrian Kingsley keep an article about a woman he supposedly had never met? As she reached toward the frame, footsteps echoed softly in the hallway behind her. She turned slowly. Someone was standing in the doorway. "If you're still with us, type 'I'm still here' in the comments. We'd love to know who's been following Naomi's journey from the very beginning. Now, let's uncover why Adrian kept that newspaper clipping for all these years, and what it reveals about the secret connection between them. Nearly a month passed before Naomi finally gathered the courage to ask the one question that had haunted her since the day she signed the contract. Why me? She had replayed every conversation, every glance, every strange question Adrian had asked. The newspaper clipping, the question about her mother's favorite flower, the way he looked at her, not like a stranger but like someone trying to confirm a memory he'd carried for years. None of it made sense, until one rainy afternoon. The Kingston Foundation was hosting its annual board meeting inside the estate. Executives filled the conference room. Lawyers reviewed charitable budgets. Representatives from children's hospitals, veterans organizations, and disaster relief agencies waited their turn to present funding proposals. Naomi had no official role. She simply sat quietly near the back, reviewing the foundation's volunteer reports. She expected another long afternoon of numbers. Instead, she found a photograph. Tucked inside one of the older foundation reports was a newspaper clipping. The headline immediately caught her attention. Unknown woman SAVES elderly crash victim before help ARRIVES. Her heart skipped. She remembered that day, 5 years earlier. It had been late autumn. The roads were slick after an unexpected storm. She had been driving home from another exhausting double shift when traffic suddenly stopped on a narrow country highway. Most drivers stayed inside their cars. Some took out their phones. Others complained about the delay. Naomi didn't think. She simply ran. A luxury sedan had skidded off the road before striking an old oak tree. The front of the vehicle was crushed. Smoke drifted from beneath the hood. An elderly woman remained trapped inside. People hesitated. Naomi didn't. She climbed through the broken passenger window despite shattered glass covering the seats. Elderly woman's breathing was shallow. "I'm here. You're not alone." She gently held the woman's trembling hand while another bystander called emergency services. "It's all right. With me." Woman whispered weakly, "I'm afraid." Naomi smiled through the panic. "I know. Am I? But we're going to be afraid together." Nearly 2 hours, Naomi refused to leave. Rain soaked through her clothes. Her hands bled from broken glass. She kept talking, sharing stories, asking simple questions, anything to keep the injured woman conscious. When paramedics finally arrived, they praised Naomi for helping stabilize the victim until rescue equipment reached the scene. One of the officers asked for her name. She gave it. Another man in an expensive suit rushed toward the ambulance. "I'm from the Kingston family. Helicopters are on the way." He reached for his wallet. "Please, take this." Naomi gently pushed his hand away. "Use it for her recovery." Then she quietly walked back to her old sedan. She still had another shift to work that evening. By the time anyone realized she had left, she was already gone. The newspaper clipping trembled in Naomi's hands. She had completely forgotten about that day. It had never felt extraordinary. Someone needed help, so she helped. That was all. A voice interrupted her thoughts. "You remember now?" She turned. Adrian stood quietly in the doorway. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Naomi slowly looked back at the article. "Woman." She swallowed hard. "Was your grandmother?" He nodded. "My grandmother, Adrian Kingsley." Realization crashed over her all at once. The hospital, the flower question, the newspaper clipping, everything suddenly fit together. She looked back at him. "You knew." "I knew the moment I saw you." "Then why didn't you tell me?" His eyes lowered briefly. "Because I wanted to know if you were still the same person." Naomi stared at him in disbelief. "You spent 5 years looking for me." Adrian gave a faint smile. "Longer than my board believes." He walked toward the window overlooking the gardens. "The police report listed your first name. The newspaper misspelled your last name. The reporter who interviewed witnesses retired. The hospital couldn't release employee records. I hired investigators. They found nothing. I donated to hospitals hoping someone would recognize the photograph. Nothing. I established scholarships. I funded community programs. Kept searching." Naomi couldn't believe what she was hearing. Remained silent for a long moment, then answered honestly. "Because my grandmother survived." He turned to face her. "Because of our money. Because of my family's influence." Survived because one exhausted young woman chose to stay with a frightened stranger. You expected nothing. You accepted nothing. When my grandmother recovered, she told me something I'll never forget. His voice softened. She said, "The richest person I met that day wasn't the one who owned the car. It was the young woman who gave away her time when she had every reason to keep walking." Naomi felt tears gathering in her eyes. "I wasn't trying to be extraordinary. I know. That's exactly why I never forgot you." He reached toward the framed newspaper clipping resting on the shelf. "Negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions, met presidents, shared rooms with the most powerful people in the world." He looked at her with a vulnerability she had never seen before. "But I'd never met someone who walked away from wealth. Because helping another human being was enough." Naomi's voice barely rose above a whisper. "So the marriage. It was never random. You already knew who I was. You didn't know me. No, I knew one extraordinary moment. I needed to know the woman behind it." Naomi finally understood. The marriage had never been about appearances. It had never been about convenience. It had never even been about 6 months. It had begun 5 years earlier, on a rain-soaked highway, when two strangers met for only a few hours. One forgot the encounter before the week was over. The other spent 5 years trying to find the woman who disappeared without asking for anything in return. As silence settled between them, the contract that had once felt like a business arrangement suddenly became something far more complicated. It wasn't built on obligation anymore. It was built on gratitude, admiration, and a connection neither of them had understood until now. For the first time since walking into Kingston Estate, Naomi looked at Adrian not as America's most emotionally distant billionaire, but as a lonely grandson who had spent years searching for the woman his grandmother called her miracle. And for the first time in years, Adrian allowed himself to hope that perhaps 6 months might be enough. to earn a place in the life of the woman he had never truly stopped looking for. The days that followed the revelation changed something neither Naomi nor Adrian could explain. The contract hadn't changed. The rules hadn't changed. Separate bedrooms, 6 months, a carefully arranged public marriage. But the silence between them no longer felt like the silence of strangers. It felt comfortable. For the first time, they began seeing one another not as obligations, but as people. One Saturday morning, Naomi wandered into the estate kitchen before sunrise. She intended to make breakfast before anyone else woke up. Instead, she found Adrian standing awkwardly in front of the stove, staring at a recipe book as though it were written in another language. "You cook?" He looked almost embarrassed. "I try." She glanced into the frying pan. "I think your pancakes are declaring war on you." He looked down. The first pancake was nearly black. The second had somehow folded itself in half. The third had attached itself permanently to the pan. Naomi couldn't help laughing. Not politely, genuinely. The sound filled the kitchen. Adrian looked at the ruined breakfast, then, to Naomi's complete surprise, he laughed too. "You can tell no one's ever been brave enough to criticize my cooking." "I wasn't criticizing." She picked up the spatula. "I was preparing to rescue your breakfast." Within minutes she rolled up her sleeves and took over. "No, not that much milk." He obediently poured less. "Flip it now." He hesitated. "Now." Pancake landed upside down on the counter. Naomi burst into laughter again. "You did that on purpose." "I absolutely did not." "You did." "Never admit it." For nearly an hour, they stood shoulder to shoulder making pancakes that slowly became edible. The staff quietly smiled as they walked past the kitchen. They had never seen Mr. Kingston laugh that freely. Later that week, Marcus arrived for dinner. He expected another uncomfortable evening inside an enormous mansion instead. He found Adrian kneeling beside the old pickup truck that Marcus had recently bought back from its new owner. "Found it?" Adrian tightened one last bolt beneath the hood before standing. "It took some convincing." Marcus stared at the truck. "I thought it was gone forever." "I don't believe sentimental things should disappear simply because life becomes difficult." Marcus walked slowly around the vehicle. The engine looked almost new. "You restored it," Adrian shrugged. "I had help." Marcus looked at him with newfound respect. "You didn't have to do this." "I wanted to." That evening, for the first time since their mother passed away, Naomi watched Marcus smile without forcing it. The sight alone was worth more than anything written in their marriage contract. A few days later, the Kingston Foundation hosted a children's health fair at St. Anne's Medical Center. Walking through the hospital again felt strangely comforting. The nurses welcomed Naomi back with hugs. Patients remembered her name. Kitchen staff insisted she visit the cafeteria. Adrian followed quietly behind her. He noticed something remarkable. People weren't drawn to Naomi because she was now married to a billionaire. They had loved her long before he entered her life. Children waved excitedly. Elderly patients asked if she was still bringing homemade cookies. Doctors interrupted meetings just to greet her. As they walked toward the pediatric wing, a young girl tugged gently on Adrian's jacket. "Mister," he knelt. "Yes, are you Naomi's husband?" "I am." The little girl smiled. "She's my favorite person here." Adrian looked toward Naomi, who was helping another child decorate a paper crown. He smiled quietly. "She's becoming mine too." That weekend, Adrian drove Naomi to a quiet countryside home. No cameras, no security convoy, no reporters, just the two of them. Inside lived Adrian Kingsley, the grandmother whose life Naomi had unknowingly saved 5 years earlier. The elderly woman looked up from her knitting. A brief moment she simply stared, then tears filled her eyes. "It's you?" Naomi immediately crossed the room. "Are you feeling?" Adrian gently held both of Naomi's hands. "Prayed for years that I'd see you again." "You remember me, my dear?" The old woman smiled warmly. "I could never forget the face that convinced me to keep fighting." Naomi hugged her carefully. Adrian looked toward Adrian. "So," she whispered loudly enough for both to hear, "has my stubborn grandson learned how to smile yet?" Naomi laughed. "A little. A miracle." Adrian sighed dramatically. "I see I've lost control of this conversation." "You never had it," Adrian replied. The room filled with laughter for the first time in years. It sounded like family. As weeks passed, Naomi began noticing things about Adrian that no magazine had ever reported. He left before sunrise some mornings without telling anyone where he was going. He returned carrying folders instead of business reports. One evening she accidentally walked into his office while searching for Evelyn. Adrian wasn't there. His desk was covered with letters, hundreds of them, handwritten. Most began exactly the same way. Dear Mr. Kingston. Curious, Naomi picked up one. It wasn't addressed to Adrian's company. It was addressed to someone called the Gray Oak Foundation. She opened another, then another. Every letter came from students, teachers, parents, nurses, veterans. Each one expressed gratitude for anonymous scholarships that had changed lives, college tuition, medical school, trade schools, music academies, single parents returning to university, first-generation graduates, thousands of dreams made possible. Yet nowhere did Adrian's name appear. When he entered the room, Naomi looked up. You created the Gray Oak Foundation. He nodded. Why keep it anonymous? He placed another scholarship application into a folder. Because gratitude should belong to opportunity. She frowned. I don't understand. If people know who paid, they sometimes feel indebted. I don't want gratitude. I want them to succeed. She stared at him. Many scholarships, he answered as though discussing the weather. I stopped counting after the first 1,000. Naomi couldn't speak. The world knew Adrian Kingsley as a ruthless billionaire. Almost no one knew he had quietly changed thousands of lives without asking for recognition. She understood then that his greatest acts of generosity existed in complete silence. Unfortunately, not everyone wanted silence. Victoria Sterling watched Adrian's growing affection for Naomi with increasing resentment. At first she spread whispers. Divorce before the year ends. Then came anonymous tips to celebrity gossip blogs. Hospital worker traps billionaire. Mystery wife hiding shocking past. Insiders questioned Kingston marriage. Within days, the stories spread across television and social media. Photographs of Naomi from years earlier appeared beside headlines calling her a fortune hunter. Comment sections exploded. Gold digger, scammer, professional liar. She planned this from the beginning. Strangers judged a woman they had never met. Some waited outside the estate gates. Others followed her to charity events. Reporters shouted questions she refused to answer. Every act of kindness was suddenly treated as manipulation. Marcus slammed his phone onto the kitchen table. They don't know you. No, they're lying. I know. So why aren't we fighting back? Naomi looked toward the window. Because sometimes the truth takes longer to arrive than a lie. Even as she spoke the words, they hurt. The attacks became relentless. Sponsors questioned her charity work. Volunteers received threatening messages. Parents at the hospital wondered if the rumors were true. Naomi could carry insults aimed at herself. She could not bear watching innocent people suffer because of her. Late one evening she quietly packed a suitcase. The contract sat folded on the bed. Perhaps ending the marriage early would protect everyone else. She carried the suitcase downstairs. Adrian was waiting in the foyer. He looked at the suitcase, then at her. Decided, can't keep doing this. They're destroying everything you built. I won't let my life become a headline. He remained silent for several moments, then he walked closer. His voice was calm. Never pleading, never demanding. If you leave. He paused. They win. Naomi looked away. They've already won. No, they've convinced you that kindness deserves punishment. She felt tears sting her eyes. I don't know how much more I can take. You won't face it alone. The first time since this strange marriage began. Adrian gently took her hand, not for the cameras, not because the contract required it, simply because she needed someone beside her. She didn't pull away. The following morning, every major news network led with the same breaking story. A confidential document had been leaked overnight. The marriage contract, every clause, every signature, every financial detail. America watched in disbelief. The headlines appeared within minutes. Billionaire paid woman $5 million to become his wife. Love story exposed as business deal. The marriage was fake all along outside Kingston estate. Reporters gathered by the hundreds. Helicopters circled overhead. Television anchors declared the scandal the biggest society story of the decade. Inside the mansion, silence returned. Naomi stared at the television in disbelief. Someone had not only betrayed their trust, they had handed the world exactly the evidence it needed to believe every lie. And somewhere beyond the estate walls, the real person responsible smiled. knowing that the hardest part of breaking two people apart was convincing everyone their love had never been real. The scandal spread faster than anyone inside Kingston Estate had imagined. By sunrise, every major news outlet carried the leaked contract. By noon, television pundits had already decided who Naomi was. No interviews, no evidence, no opportunity to defend herself. Just opinions repeated until they sounded like facts. The world no longer saw the woman who had spent years comforting lonely hospital patients. It saw a headline, and headlines were easier to judge than people. The consequences came quickly, too quickly. Marcus received the email during breakfast. At first he smiled. He assumed it was another reminder about orientation for the engineering scholarship he had worked toward since high school. Instead, his face slowly lost all color. Naomi noticed immediately. Marcus. He didn't answer. He simply handed her the phone. The scholarship committee had suspended his award pending an ethics review. The letter explained that, because of the ongoing controversy surrounding his family, the organization believed continued sponsorship might damage public confidence in the program. Naomi read the message twice. Then a third time. None of the words changed. Marcus hadn't cheated. He hadn't lied. He hadn't done anything wrong. Yet his future was being measured against rumors. He quietly folded the phone shut. "I'll find another way." Naomi looked at him, heartbroken. "You shouldn't have to." That afternoon, Naomi drove to St. Anne's Medical Center, hoping that at least one part of her life had remained untouched. The familiar hallways suddenly felt different. Conversations stopped as she walked past. Some coworkers smiled sympathetically, others looked away. Her supervisor invited her into a private office. The meeting lasted less than 10 minutes. "No one doubts your character." Supervisor's voice trembled. "But reporters have been waiting outside the hospital. They're following patients. They're interrupting families. Our board believes the situation is becoming unsafe." Naomi already knew what came next. "We're placing you on indefinite leave." She nodded before the sentence was even finished. "I'm sorry." "So am I." She removed her employee identification badge, the same badge she had worn proudly for years. As she walked through the cafeteria one final time, several elderly patients waved at her through the dining room windows. She smiled back. They deserved a happy goodbye, not the tears she fought to hide until she reached the parking lot. The following evening, Naomi insisted on visiting her childhood home. She wanted to collect a few remaining family photographs. Marcus drove. Neither spoke much. As they turned onto their street, their hearts sank. The front fence had been spray-painted with cruel words. "Liar, gold digger, fake wife." Several windows had been shattered. Flowers her mother had planted years earlier had been trampled into the soil. Neighbors stood quietly nearby, ashamed of what had happened. Mrs. Delgado crossed the street carrying a broom. "We tried to stop them." Naomi looked around. "You shouldn't have had to." An elderly man from 2 houses down placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Most of us know who you really are." His words meant more than he realized. Sometimes when the world grows loud, a single voice of kindness is enough to remind someone they are not alone. The media frenzy reached another level. Reporters camped outside every entrance to Kingston Estate. Helicopters circled overhead from sunrise until dusk. Microphones appeared wherever Naomi went. "Did you marry for money? Was the relationship ever real? How much were you paid to pretend?" She answered none of them, not because she was ashamed, because she had learned that truth spoken into a storm is rarely heard. The scandal was no longer affecting only Naomi. Kingston Holdings began losing billions in market value. Investors questioned Adrian's judgment. Clients postponed major agreements. Television analysts debated whether he could survive the damage to his reputation. Inside the boardroom, the atmosphere had turned icy. One director spoke first. "We have to protect the company." Another nodded. "Shareholders are demanding action." A third slid a folder toward Adrian. "Recommendation is simple." He didn't open it. "We believe the marriage should end immediately." Silence settled over the room. Every pair of eyes remained fixed on Adrian. Finally, he spoke. "No," one word, nothing more. The chairman leaned forward. "You are risking billions." "I know. Thousands of employees depend on this company." "I know." "Then why refuse?" Adrian calmly closed the folder without reading it. Because loyalty means nothing if it disappears the moment it becomes expensive. No one answered, some understood, others didn't. Across town, Victoria watched the news from her office. A slow smile spread across her face. Everything was unfolding exactly as she had hoped. The board was divided. The media was relentless. Public opinion had turned. Soon, she believed, Naomi would leave on her own. Then Adrian would be alone again, exactly where Victoria wanted him. She poured herself a cup of coffee and quietly whispered, "It's only a matter of time." Late that night, Naomi stood alone on the balcony outside her room. The city lights shimmered in the distance. She had lost her job. Marcus had lost his scholarship. Her family home had been vandalized. Adrian's company was bleeding value every day she remained beside him. Perhaps leaving really was the kindest thing she could do. She opened the drawer where the contract had been stored. $5 million. It would rebuild the house, pay for Marcus's education, give them both a fresh start somewhere far away from cameras and headlines. She could walk away. Most people would. No one would blame her. But another question refused to leave her heart. If she left now, who would stand beside Adrian, the man who had protected strangers without seeking recognition, the grandson who had spent years searching for the woman who once comforted his grandmother, the billionaire who laughed over burnt pancakes and quietly restored an old pickup truck because he knew what memories meant? For the first time since the scandal began, Naomi realized she wasn't deciding between money and pride. She was deciding between fear and loyalty. The following morning, Daniel Harper, Adrian's longtime attorney, requested a private meeting. He placed the original contract on the library table. "There is something you were never shown," Naomi frowned. "I read every page." "You read every page presented for signature." He turned to a sealed appendix attached behind the legal documents. The final clause was confidential. He carefully opened it. Naomi read the paragraph once, then again. Her breathing slowed. The clause stated that if Naomi chose to terminate the marriage because of sustained public harassment, media persecution, or reputational harm beyond her reasonable control, the agreement would immediately end, and she would still receive the entire $5 million. No penalties, no lawsuits, no conditions. She looked up in disbelief. "This was always here," Daniel nodded, "from the very first draft. Adrian wrote it himself." Naomi stared at the page. "He never told me, specifically instructed us not to." "Why?" Daniel smiled sadly. "Because he never wanted you to feel trapped. Believed that if staying ever became too painful, you should always have the freedom to leave with your dignity and your future protected." Naomi's eyes filled with tears. "So every time I thought I was sacrificing everything, I could have walked away. He knew that." She closed the contract gently. "He was willing to risk his reputation, his company, and billions of dollars, while making sure I would never lose mine." Daniel looked toward the rain falling beyond the library windows. "There are many wealthy men in this country. Few understand that the greatest gift you can give another person is the freedom to choose." Naomi sat in silence. The contract no longer looked like a business agreement. It looked like a promise written by a man who had protected her long before she ever knew he was protecting her. Only one question remained. If Adrian had gone to such extraordinary lengths to make sure she could leave at any moment, why would a man who claimed he barely knew her be willing to risk everything, just to make sure she never had to? The morning of the Kingston Holdings emergency board meeting arrived beneath a gray sky that seemed to mirror the uncertainty surrounding the company. Television vans lined both sides of the street. Reporters crowded behind security barriers. Shareholders, employees, and curious onlookers gathered outside the headquarters, waiting to learn whether one of the country's largest companies would survive its deepest crisis. Inside, the atmosphere was equally tense. The boardroom was filled long before the meeting officially began. Directors spoke in hushed voices. Investors checked their phones every few seconds as the company's stock price continued to fluctuate. No one knew what Adrian Kingsley intended to do. No one knew whether his marriage or his company would survive the day. Naomi walked into the room beside Adrian. For the first time since the scandal began, she held her head high. Not because the headlines had changed, because she finally knew who she was. No newspaper could take that from her. Victoria Sterling arrived moments later. She wore a confident smile and greeted several directors as though the outcome had already been decided. She believed she had won. She believed public opinion would force Adrian to protect the company by ending the marriage. She had underestimated one thing, the truth. The chairman called the meeting to order. First, agenda item concerns the reputational damage facing Kingston Holdings. Before he could continue, Adrian stood. Have a statement. Room fell silent. For weeks, my wife has been accused of manipulating me for financial gain. He looked toward Naomi. Those accusations are false. I asked Naomi to marry me. I pursued her. I wrote the agreement. I insisted on every legal protection included within it. Several reporters immediately began typing. Adrian continued, "If blame is to be assigned, assign it to me." Naomi looked at him in surprise. He had just accepted every criticism the media had directed toward him, without hesitation, without trying to protect himself. Victoria rose from her chair. That's a touching speech. It doesn't explain how confidential legal documents reached the press. She folded her arms. Unless someone in this room leaked them. Her eyes briefly settled on Naomi. The accusation hung in the air. Naomi slowly stood. I didn't leak the contract. Victoria smiled. Can you prove that? Before Naomi could answer, Daniel entered the room carrying a small evidence case. I can. Every eye turned toward him. He connected a laptop to the large presentation screen. Cybersecurity investigation concluded at 4 o'clock this morning. A timeline appeared, electronic access records, encrypted emails, financial transfers. One by one, Daniel revealed the findings. The contract had not been stolen by reporters. It had been copied weeks earlier using executive credentials belonging to Victoria Sterling. The room fell completely silent. Victoria's smile disappeared. That's impossible. Daniel calmly displayed another document. A forensic analysis confirmed that several anonymous messages sent to gossip outlets originated from devices registered to Victoria's private consulting company. Additional records showed payments to public relations firms hired to amplify the rumors across social media. The campaign had been carefully planned. It had never been spontaneous. Still, Daniel wasn't finished. We also discovered altered financial reports submitted to the board. Another document appeared, then another. Several signatures had been forged. Internal recommendations had been rewritten before reaching directors. Votes had been manipulated. The goal was simple. Create enough instability to force Adrian from leadership. Once he resigned, Victoria would become interim chief executive. The board members looked at one another in disbelief. Many realized they had unknowingly based important decisions on falsified information. Victoria's confidence finally cracked. You don't understand. Her voice trembled. I built this company too. I worked for everything I earned. I deserved that position. Adrian answered quietly. You deserve the opportunity to compete for it honestly, by destroying innocent people. At that moment, another voice spoke from the doorway. I'd like to say something. Everyone turned. Adrian Kingsley slowly entered the room with the assistance of her walking cane. The room immediately rose in respect. She looked first at Victoria, then at the directors, finally at Naomi. My family has built businesses for generations. She smiled gently. But companies aren't measured only by profit. They are measured by character. She walked toward Naomi. This young woman saved my life. She didn't know my name. She didn't know my family's wealth. She expected nothing in return. She turned toward the board. If this company cannot recognize integrity when it stands before you, then no quarterly report will ever save it. Room remained silent, not because there was nothing left to say, because there was nothing left to argue. The chairman requested a final vote. One by one, the directors raised their hands. Victoria Sterling was removed from every executive position she held within Kingston Holdings. An independent investigation into the fraud began immediately. The board unanimously reaffirmed Adrian as chief executive. Outside, reporters quickly learned that the story they had spent weeks telling had been built on deception. The headlines changed, not all at once, but they changed. Stories emerged about Naomi's years of service at St. Anne's Medical Center. Former patients shared memories of her kindness. Scholarship recipients unexpectedly discovered that the anonymous donor behind the Gray Oak Foundation had been Adrian all along. Public opinion shifted, not because anyone demanded it, because the truth finally had room to speak. 6 months passed, exactly as the contract had promised. The final meeting took place in Daniel Harper's office. No reporters, no cameras, no board members, only 4 people: Daniel, Adrian, Naomi, and Alina, who insisted on attending because, as she cheerfully explained, "I've earned the right to witness this ending." Daniel placed 2 sets of divorce papers on the table. "The contractual term has been fulfilled." He smiled warmly. "Will you both now sign the divorce papers?" Naomi looked at Adrian, then at the documents. Slowly, she picked up the pen. She signed her name, not because she wanted to leave, but because she wanted whatever happened next to be a choice rather than an obligation. She placed the pen down. Daniel slid the second copy toward Adrian. The room became very quiet. Adrian looked at the papers for several long moments, then he lifted them gently instead of signing. He tore them in half. The sound of paper ripping echoed through the room. Everyone stared. Daniel blinked in surprise. Even Alina looked delighted. Adrian turned toward Naomi. There was no audience now, no shareholders, no cameras, no contract, no conditions, only truth. He stepped closer. Then slowly he lowered himself onto one knee, not as the head of a global company, not as one of the wealthiest men in America, simply as a man whose carefully guarded heart had finally found the courage to be seen. His voice was steady but softer than Naomi had ever heard it. "First time I asked you to marry me, I offered you security. I offered you a contract. I offered you 6 months." He smiled. "You gave me something far greater. You reminded me that kindness still exists. You reminded me that loyalty isn't something money can buy." Somewhere between burnt pancakes, hospital hallways, old pickup trucks, and quiet mornings, "I fell in love with you." He reached into his jacket and removed a small velvet box. Inside was a simple ring, elegant, timeless, nothing extravagant, everything meaningful. This time, he looked directly into her eyes. "I'm asking without the contract, without the money, without expectations, without an ending already written." He took a slow breath. "Naomi Carter, will you choose me?" Tears filled Naomi's eyes before she could answer. She remembered the frightened grandson searching for the woman who had comforted his grandmother. She remembered the billionaire who quietly funded dreams he never took credit for. She remembered the lonely man who had protected her freedom even when it meant risking everything he owned. She laughed through her tears. You still ask impossible questions." Adrian smiled. "Noticed." She stepped closer. Resting her hands gently against his face, she whispered the answer he had never expected to hear. "Yes, because of the mansion, because of the company, because of everything you've given me." She smiled. "Because every day you chose to become the kind of man my mother hoped I would someday find." As Adrian slipped the ring onto her finger, Alina quietly wiped away a tear. Some love stories begin with perfect timing. Theirs began with an accident on a rainy road. It grew through sacrifice, trust, forgiveness, and the courage to choose one another freely. And that, Alina thought with a contented smile, was the only kind of love worth keeping. For a long moment, Naomi couldn't speak. The room disappeared, the lawyers, the documents, the cameras that had once followed them, the headlines that had nearly destroyed them. None of it mattered anymore. Only one man remained in front of her, not America's youngest billionaire, not the CEO whose signature could change markets overnight. Just Adrian, kneeling before her with nothing left to hide. She looked down at the ring. It wasn't the largest diamond she had ever seen. In fact, knowing Adrian, she suspected it had been chosen for a reason that had nothing to do with its price. Simple, elegant, unpretentious, just like the love he was finally brave enough to offer. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she smiled. "When you first asked me to marry you," her voice trembled softly, "you offered me $5 million. A gentle laugh escaped her. "I thought you were trying to rescue me." She shook her head. "I was wrong." She stepped closer until only a few inches separated them. "You never tried to buy my heart. You simply waited for me to see yours." Adrian looked up at her, his own eyes beginning to glisten. Naomi gently reached for his hands and helped him to his feet. Then, without another word, she wrapped her arms around him. The embrace wasn't dramatic, it wasn't perfect, it wasn't for photographers. It was the kind of hug two tired souls give each other after surviving a storm they never expected to face. She rested her forehead against his. "My answer is yes." A smile slowly spread across Adrian's face, But not because of the contract, she shook her head. Because of your wealth, because of the mansion. Because you could give me a life most people only dream about. She placed one hand over his heart. I'm saying yes because, for the first time in a very long time, I know someone truly sees me, what I own, what I can do for them, what the world says about me. You saw me long before I knew your name. Somehow, you never stopped believing I was worth finding. Room fell silent. Even Daniel quietly looked away, giving them the privacy such a moment deserved. Eleanor smiled through happy tears. Lived a long life, she whispered, and I have learned something. The greatest miracles rarely announce themselves. They usually arrive looking like ordinary people. Months later, spring returned to the neighborhood where Naomi had grown up. The little blue house no longer carried scars from broken windows or hateful graffiti. Fresh white paint covered every wall. New flower beds surrounded the front porch. The old porch swing had been repaired and polished. Along the walkway, rows of yellow daisies bloomed in the morning sun. Naomi knelt beside the garden, smiling as she pressed another flower into the soil, her mother's favorite. She had kept her promise. The house had stayed in the family, not because money had saved it, because hope had. Marcus stepped out onto the porch wearing a navy blue graduation gown. He adjusted the cap on his head and laughed. I still can't believe this is happening. Naomi stood and brushed the dirt from her hands. You earned every bit of it, he smiled. No, earned it. A familiar black sedan pulled quietly into the driveway. Adrian stepped out carrying a small wrapped package. Marcus grinned. If that's another toolbox, I'm starting to think you're trying to turn me into a mechanic. Adrian laughed. No, this one is much lighter. Marcus opened the package. Inside rested an engraved fountain pen, simple, classic. On the inside of the case were a few carefully etched words. Build something that outlives you. Marcus looked up. Keep this forever. I hope, Adrian replied, that one day you'll wear it out. Year later, the old community center on Maple Street had once stood empty. Now it welcomed families every morning. A new sign hung above the entrance. The Carter Family Home Foundation. Its mission was simple: to help hardworking families facing foreclosure because of illness, unexpected job loss, or temporary hardship, financial counseling, emergency mortgage assistance, legal support, job placement services. No family would face losing their home alone if the foundation could help. The idea had been Naomi's. She knew what it felt like to count down the days until strangers claimed the place filled with your memories. She wanted fewer people to experience that fear. The foundation quickly became known for one unusual policy. Every family who received help was treated with dignity. No publicity, no photographs, no stories shared without permission, just quiet compassion. One afternoon, a reporter asked Naomi a question during the foundation's anniversary celebration. Many people assume your husband funded this entire project. Naomi smiled. He helped. So why isn't his name on the building? She looked across the room. Adrian stood near the refreshment table speaking with volunteers, completely unnoticed. He had slipped into the event without security, without announcements, without expecting recognition. Naomi smiled to herself. Because he insisted it shouldn't be. Across the room, Adrian caught her eye and gave the smallest shrug, as if to say it wasn't important to him. It truly wasn't. What mattered wasn't whose name appeared above the door. What mattered was the family walking through it. Later that evening, after the last volunteers had gone home, Naomi discovered a new envelope on her desk. There was no signature, only a short handwritten note, for the next family who needs a second chance. Inside was a donation large enough to keep the foundation operating for another 5 years. She smiled without needing to ask who had sent it. Some people gave because they wanted to be remembered. Adrian gave because someone else needed hope. That had never changed. As the sun began to set, Naomi and Adrian returned to the front porch of her childhood home, the same porch where lawyers had once offered her $5 million. The same porch where fear had almost convinced her that desperate choices were the only choices. They sat quietly on the restored swing. No cameras, no contracts, no headlines, just two people watching the evening light settle over the neighborhood. Naomi slipped her hand into Adrian's. You know, if someone had told me 2 years ago that accepting the strangest proposal in the world would lead me here, I would have laughed. Adrian smiled. I probably would have believed them. She laughed softly. You always did have more faith than I did. He shook his head. No. I just spent 5 years looking for proof that kindness still existed. He looked at her. I found it. Naomi rested her head against his shoulder. The breeze carried the scent of blooming daisies through the garden. Some promises take years to bloom. Some prayers arrive through doors we almost refuse to open. And sometimes, the greatest blessings begin as the greatest mysteries. Money can buy a contract. Power can buy attention. Status can open doors, but none of them can purchase trust. None of them can manufacture loyalty. And none of them can force a heart to stay. Only kindness has that power, because kindness is remembered long after wealth is counted. It is carried from one life into another. It asks for nothing, yet somehow gives everything. That is why real love is never built on what someone can offer. It is built on who they choose to be when no one is watching. And in the end, that choice changed 2 lives forever. Sometimes life offers you everything you prayed for. It just arrives disguised as the one thing you swore you'd never accept.